What is the oldest dictionary in the Bantu regions of the Bantu language? At first, I thought a couple years ago that it was the dictionary made by the Zulus or made of the Zulus in the 1800s. And then I discovered another one that was earlier than that, about the 1700s. I'd fully convinced myself that this dictionary had to be the youngest. And of course, there was the Swahili dictionaries or Swahili translations. And I had fully convinced myself that those are the oldest. And it's true that they're pretty old. In fact, they might be the oldest. But on the other side of the Swahili coast, or opposite the Swahili coast, there is yet another dictionary, one that will give us great insight into the history of the people of the Kingdom of Congo. This dictionary was written by Italians and Spanish people, and luckily it has two translations of words. First in Latin, and then in Spanish, and finally in red, it's translated into the Bantu language. One insight that we can get from this dictionary is how they hear words differently than other people. So, for example, the entire language of the Bantu people is always translated through the eyes of others, which gives us a in on what they hear versus what is being said. Now, if we look at the first part of the dictionary, as it says, it was written by or transcribed and parsed version of Joris van Giel's 1652 Vocabularium Latinum, Hispanicum, and Congese ad essum missionario. Now, you'll be surprised to know that I don't speak Latin, so half these words mean nothing to me. Manuscript kept in the Biblioteca Nacional Central di Roma Fondi Minori. Now, I know what you're thinking. Okay, you found an old dictionary of the Bantu languages, so why do you care? Well, it's very important if you're going to compare African languages to each other to know which words are modern inventions and which words go back in time. And so that's why I'm still seeking out the oldest Swahili dictionary, and I want it to be in Arabic and Swahili. I don't want it to be in English or any of that other thing. That's why I found a dictionary that was in English and Congese, but I threw that one away because clearly it's not as old as this one. And so if you're going to compare the languages, you have to find out at what point in history, at one point in time, did certain words come up in. So in other words, you don't want to sit there and say the word ma for water in all of these languages is exactly the same. And then when you go check dictionaries that go back in time, that word is invented maybe in the 14 or 1500s. That would be quite embarrassing. And of course, it's important to have this dictionary because a lot of people now are reassessing their statements in linguistics because of the discovery. Well, it's been discovered a long time ago, but the usage, the common usage of it now, as it's being put in public display, and it's not just a secret for specific museums. And of course, people are going all over the world trying to find the oldest versions of these that they can find all over the world. What will this do for us? Like I said, it will help us compare which words are new and which words are old. Like when I was reading that Congolese or the Kingdom of Congo writing, and that person said those little pebbles are called lumache, and the word lumache, at least as I translated, means stone. Today, it tells me that that word mache is not, as what I was told when I was younger, a Khoisan word, but actually a Bantu word. And this helps us think about the difference about that. That means if I can find a similar word to that in ancient Egyptian, then that would be a more direct line, knowing that it had nothing to do with the Khoisan people. Because why wouldn't it have anything to do with them? Because the Khoisan languages barely contribute anything to other Bantu languages except for Zulu and Xhosa and a lot of other Nguni languages, Swazi and stuff like that, and a few languages in the Pygmy regions. But the Pygmy languages are disconnected, except the Bantu Pygmies, disconnected from the Bantu languages anyway. One of its other uses is creating a map for the Bantus. Because remember, I showed you the Zulus and all of that, and that they had a vague map. But you can see right here that we have, for example, autumn, autumnus, which we can see with the Spanish version, which is important because if you mistranslate the Italian word, you might as well just throw away the other translation, which is otono, which is absolutely what autumn is in Spanish. But if you look at that afterwards, it's Mbangala. Now, for anyone who speaks Congolese, I hope that this word still exists because I've looked it up and I can't find anywhere where today they still use this word at all. You can see there autumnalis kan Bangala, which is now changing the verb or noun version of this word. And so we have right here an example of why this is going to be very important in writing down every single thing that we know about these populations and being able to say, when people say something like painting didn't exist back in the Bantu era, being able to say, here's a word for paint from the 1600s. The 1600s, by the way, is when they first came, so it's not even that old. Here's the word for painting, and then we look at the Arabic words and we look at all these other things. And it's so important to have something like this. It's so important. But I hope a lot of people do appreciate it because I'm going to be using it in future videos to reference a lot of words. If we look at the last word, for example, in this dictionary, the last word in this little frame of the dictionary, we can see there the word avos in Italian, and then we can see the word the abuelo, which sounds a lot like abuelo in Spanish, which means grandfather, which then means this word nkai and nkaka, meaning which is the plural version of it, ankaka, is probably related to the word gogo or the word um, baba in the Berber languages. Dada is another one. Dada, Nkaka, Baba, Gogo. All of these words mean someone who's really old. But we don't need to live in the world of speculation because, as you can see here in the Congolese language of Lingala, the word for my grandfather is Nkokoyami. So, this word that in Congolese is Nkaka, in Lingala is Nkoko, and in the Nguni languages is Gogo. You can see is the same word, but there's something deeper than this because the word for an elder person is Kulu. But here's the problem. In Tamazight, all the way in North Africa, as you can see in this dictionary, the word for grandfather is Baba Hulu, and the word for grandmother is Mama Hulu. Now, this would be one small thing if in Arabia this wasn't the case too, as we will see if we look at the sentence in Akkadian, the language that is close to Arabic. So before we even move on with this at all, we have to first look at it. So in the Akkadian version of the word, I is father. It's a version of in Hebrew. You see there where they say Ivenu, right? Ivenu Malkenu, our father, our king. You can see here I is father. Abba is grandfather. Just like if it's written here Abanaka, in the house of her father, Abanaka. And so before we can even move on from anything else, we have to look at it. So this is a dictionary of um, Tamazight. Then you can see here that you have other words that have nothing to do with this so that I can compare, and you can see that it's actually Amazigh. So we go Imdi for grain, Naha for grammar, but then we go to grandfather, Baba Hulu, grandmother, Mama Hulu. Then we go straight to the Zulu language, Mame Hulu, right there, my or our grandmother. Someone needs to explain this first before we can move on to anything else. The connection here is multidimensional, as I will return to the dictionary of the Congolese from the 1600s. But let's first carry on with down this line of Afro-Asiatic languages, Akkadian, Tamazight, and then the Bantu language of Zulu crossing over to the Congese. So in the Afro-Asiatic language of the Berbers, we see that the word Hulu on its own means big or grand or gigantic. We see that in the language of Akkadian, the word kal or gal, depending on its phonetic value, depending on how you want to say it, is big or grand. Notice how in the Akkadian the k sound is maintained, whereas in the Berber it's a h sound. And you'll notice this about these languages, the Afroasiatic and the Bantu languages, is that the k and the h sound are transferable, and they have a middle value which is sound, like in the word Khalid, where it can be Khalid, Khalid, or Halid. So as you can see with that other word, that the word, the U and the A are interchangeable. So Kal and Cool can be the same word, just said differently. This is based on something that Bantu and the Afroasiatic languages have in common. But let's go to this word, Nkaka, which means Onkai, which means older or elder. But you can see that this word is a shortening of another word, right? How do we know this? Well, all we have to do is just look at a different word. For example, Petrus Magnus or Petrus Magnus, which means great uncle. So Petrus, we can see there, Kanzi. This Kanzi means uncle in Ohemeno de Pedra, Padre, which means uncle of my father or the brother of my father. So this word uncle here, but it says Petrus Magnus, that means my great uncle. And you can see down in the red, which is the translation of the Bantu language or the Congolese, it's Nkan Pangui Ankaka. So this Magnus Magnus, as we all know, is the word magnitude, which means size. Ankaka, which is the same as that word there. Now, some of you might say, well, isn't it the same in the other languages that the word grand is used to mean the older or the person who is the grandfather? Absolutely. The difference is they don't have a word that sounds exactly the same in multiple languages. And then you connect it the same in that same languages. Because remember, Baba and Abba is all the same word meaning father. Whereas you go to Spanish, Italian, Latin, French, whatever, pick a language around the world, all of that is lost. These two languages happen to have the same exact word for the word grand and the word father.
Easy
But
digestible,
so what?
strengthen
So what
memory,
if you can find
rich in
hundreds of
calcium,
similarities
protective
between
polarities.
Bantu
So
languages and
that's why
Afro-Asiatic languages
presenting the
that
deer
would
ribs
rule
to the god
the
in that time.
Afro-Asiatic
And
areas?
this is the high, this is the
So
king,
what if we can
but he
find
pretended
words that are
himself as a high
similar
priest.
and even
He
the
holds
grammar
the
that
censer and
is only
burn the
used
incense
in
inside
multiple
it.
areas? So what? So what if the ancient Egyptians themselves made it very clear that they looked like a lot of their neighbors and even were highly appreciative of their origins deep in Africa? So what if the people have words that are similar between very strategically or very base words? Nothing strategic, nothing deep, nothing crazy, not like a word that can move like intellectual. Not a word like that. Words like water, mud, sand, clay, people, run, jump. Who cares if those words are very similar? What about the proximity? What about the fact that we know that the center of Africa is where most of these people come from? But again, who cares? Who cares that we find masks all over Africa and Egypt was like a mask zone? Who cares that when you compare the people of different continents, you find various similarities that span a longer distance than that of the Nubians and the Egyptians, and that somebody from India can be related to someone from Australia linguistically, but then someone who's literally the next door neighbor of the Egyptians is somehow worlds apart from the other. Who cares that the Nile is one of the most important things in ancient Egypt and that they make lots of parking stations there and erect buildings and that those buildings look exactly the same and the depictions of the Nubians look exactly the same as all the people? Who cares that in the proximity of it all, we find that the Niger Congolese languages that lie just on the opposite side of the Egyptian languages, too, though they expand a wide range, still represent a larger language? Should we take proximity not as a real thing? Should someone being your next door neighbor mean that there could never be any relation when we know that almost everywhere in the world where this happens, almost 100% of the time, people will assume that those people are related? Let's give it a shot. Let's take Japanese and Koreans, Koreans and Chinese, Chinese and Serbians and Siberians, Chinese and Taiwanese, Taiwanese and Papuans, Papuans and Indonesians, Indonesians and Indians, Indians and Elamites, Elamites and Persians, Persians and Sumerians, Sumerians and Afghans, Afghans and other Middle Easterners, Middle Easterners and Africans, North Africans, Egyptians, Egyptians and Nubians. Suddenly, it stops. Suddenly, being close to your neighbor, it doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't help anymore. All of the entire line until I get to Africa, it just stops right there. Hold the music. We know that their close neighbors could not be possibly related to each other. But remember, as soon as we leave Egypt and that part of Africa and North Africa and we go to Greece, suddenly it's back again. We go, Syrians, and then we go Lebanese, and then we go Turks, and then we go Greeks, Italians, Czechs, British, the British with the Germanic with the Scandinavians. Again, it's back. Like people being close to each other is almost evidence by itself that people are related.